We would like to take this opportunity to thank the NFL, Ted Turner, and all the sponsors of this tournament, and of course, the state of Utah, the citizens of Salt Lake, and this great nation that allows us to have civic debates like these. The late Ronald Reagan once said, "The most terrifying words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government, and I'm here to help.'" It seems that although government has the potential to be a force for good in theory, in practice, it often starts programs that are more trouble than they are worth. Some members of governments in the United States and around the world now want to expand government even further and create a mandatory national service program. This program cannot even be run well in developed countries like the United States, and its negative effects would be magnified in the undeveloped world. For this reason, my partner and I oppose the resolution that all young adults in every nation should be required to perform at least 1 year of mandatory national service. We can understand the reasons why service is undesirable in 3 ways. First, contention 1. Mandatory national service would create a corruptible bureaucracy. From Bruce Chapman, former director of the U.S. Census Bureau and a U.S. ambassador to the UN organization, who in fall 2002 states, "Universal service likewise would be an invitation to scandal. The military draft was bad enough, dispatching the budding scientist to pick up paper on a base's roadsides and sending the sickly malcontent to deliver meal trays to patients in base hospitals. People with powerful parents got cushy positions, while the poor got the onerous tasks. When labor is both free and abundant, it will be squandered and abused. Inevitably, the government would have to create a huge and inefficient bureaucracy to manage service. And with a bureaucracy as extensive as the one service would demand, misdoings would run rampant. Politicians would be allowed to define what service is and use the program to their own benefit. These programs would be magnified in developing nations already prone to scandal. Contention 2. The cost of mandatory service would far outweigh the benefits. From Bruce Chapman, previously cited, who explains, "The cost of universal service would be prohibitive. Direct costs would include those for assembling, sorting, allocating, and training several million youth in an unending manpower convoy. Because organized compulsion costs more than real volunteering, however, the indirect expenses for governments would be still greater. Chief among these are the hidden financial costs of universal national service to the economy in the form of foregone labor. The cost of universal service for 1 year would not be $80 billion, with certain additional economic benefits as Latan would have it, but roughly $120 billion, with considerable additional losses to the economy as a whole. Thus, the cost of national service would be tremendous. The government would have to spend massive amounts of money on service that could be better spent somewhere else. Moreover, the youth involved in service could better spend their time training to be doctors or teachers." Contention 3. Mandatory service would harm true efforts towards society. From Nan Hawthorne, Editor-in-Chief of Volunteer Management Review in May 1st, 2002. "Making community service mandatory assumes that you can make someone value something by forcing them to do it. Anyone who has spent time with teenagers knows how unlikely that really is. It's a rebellious age. What long-term effects will occur when the rebellion is against service? Even when truly voluntary, volunteering can also be frustrating, disillusioning, and demoralizing when volunteers are misled or mistreated, or have had their time and talents exploited or squandered. As we cannot guarantee that mandating service will be free of the false assumptions listed here, the potential for the practice backfiring is tremendous. Making service mandatory would create a lifelong stigma against service and probably against government and democracy in general. These effects would be especially negative in countries with fledgling democracies, and thus service would make the world less safe. Volunteerism is too valuable to be threatened by mandatory service. In conclusion, because service threatens to harm social, economic, and political patterns irreparably, we must reject mandatory service and oppose the resolution."
All right, first of all, Patrick and I would just like to thank our families. We'd also like to thank the Neosho and Bolivar Public Forum teams who have really helped us prepare for this. And we especially want to thank our squad from Parkview High School and our coach, Mrs. Wedgeworth. So, thank you. All right. Devoting time and energy to others is one of the most beneficial acts that one can do. National service is a link between meeting unmet social needs and sparking involvement within a community. Because the resolution asks whether we should or should not use national service, one must realize that a vote in pro only makes sense. It is for these reasons and many more that Patrick and I stand firmly resolved that all young adults in every nation should be required to perform at least one full year of national service. You can see why further through 3 main points. First of all, national service is viewed favorably throughout the international community. From Union Today, 2001. Many countries do this, and it is not viewed as negative, said Dr. Ann Livingston, Associate Professor of Political Science. It is viewed as a way to give back to your country some of the investment they have made to you in terms of your education, health, and privileges. Again, realize through this piece of evidence that there are many countries out there already who have service programs. If we move towards a national service program worldwide, this would be viewed favorably by the international community. We must look to that when making our decision. Secondly, realize that national service is a soft power foreign policy tool that decreases global terrorism. From the Brookings Institute, 2003. When the Peace Corps was founded, the Cold War struggle to contain communism was the dominant foreign policy goal of the United States government. At the same time, the United States deployed an array of soft instruments to win the hearts and minds of the majority of the world's population that lived in non-aligned third world countries. A recent Brookings study refers to American military power as a kind of glue for global security and stability. At the same time, more of the developing world views this power resentfully as a means of extending American economic and cultural domination. By contrast, the Peace Corps is one of the few forms of engagement offered by the United States government that is eagerly embraced by developing countries. This is arguably a sufficient reason for expanding it. At the moment, the United States faces considerable skepticism. Public diplomacy may not be sufficient to turn the tide. Personal relationships have always been the best way to promote American ideals. Fostering these relationships has been the greatest success of the Peace Corps. Again, realize what this piece of evidence is telling you is that international programs like the Peace Corps, like the National Guard and military service, are definitely considered national service. You must see that these programs foster good relationships between different countries. You can see that these individual relationships, again, lead to a decrease in global terrorism because there's better understanding between countries. That's what national service worldwide is going to do. You can see through the example of the Peace Corps that this is already happening, and that by moving to a national service program worldwide, we're going to decrease global terrorism. Thirdly and finally, realize that national service is a way to give back to the community and meet social needs. From Latan, 2002. Young people serving in a civilian capacity in particular would help satisfy unmet social needs beyond those associated with homeland security, improving the reading skills of tens of millions of Americans who cannot now read English at a high school level, cleaning up blighted neighborhoods, and helping provide social, medical, and other services to the elderly and to low-income individuals and families. Universal service would establish firmly the notion that with rights for ourselves comes responsibilities to others. Of course, the Constitution guarantees all citizens certain rights of free speech, of due process of law, to be free from discrimination, to vote, without asking anything of them in return. But why shouldn't citizens be required to give something to their country in exchange for the full range of rights to which citizenship entitles them? Again, realize through this piece of evidence that national service can help within each and every nation. It can help improve the reading skills of people. It can help the elderly and improve neighborhoods. You can see that national service is a really good idea, and it's not ridiculous for a government to ask something of their citizens in return for their rights. Realize that national service can help here in America and around the world, and for all those reasons, vote pro.
Okay, now to begin, how many nations have this kind of mandatory service where they force every young adult to do service other than just military conscription?
Okay, well actually, the truth is that there are no countries right now anywhere around the world that have a mandatory service program for all of their young adults.
Okay.
There are a few countries, though, that have a mandatory service program for certain individuals in that country.
All right, so if this mandatory service program for all young adults is viewed so favorably, as you allege, how come no nations have instituted it?
Well, there are probably a variety of reasons, and that's not really what this debate is about. We're just debating about whether or not national service in itself is a good idea, whether or not we should or should not implement it. And I think through the evidence today, you can see that national service is a good idea. It should be implemented.
Okay, but what are some of the reasons why they haven't instituted it if they view it so favorably then?
Well, first of all, I guess there are several arguments that I can make about that. First of all, there are many countries that have service programs within that nation.
Most of them aren't mandatory for all young adults, right?
Actually, many of them are mandatory for some adults. Like in Germany, it's mandatory for all young males. Or in Nigeria, it's mandatory for all student or citizens who are going to university. So it is mandatory for a huge section of the population, but no countries have it for all of their citizens.
All right.
Now I have some questions for you.
Okay.
In your first point, you said that there would be potential harm to national service, and you talked about how it would create this huge bureaucracy within the United States and around the world trying to control these national service programs, correct?
Right.
All right, but what about the Peace Corps? That's a national service program that we have here in the United States right now, and we don't see a huge bureaucracy as a result of that.
Well, that's because the Peace Corps isn't huge. The Peace Corps is about 3,000 people. I mean, essentially, if you're forcing every young adult into the nation into one single program, that would be, the logistics for that are nearly impossible.
Okay, but what about some of the nations that force half of their young adults into a national service program, like Germany, where it forces all young males into this kind of program? Does this have a huge bureaucracy because of this?
I would argue that it does have the huge bureaucracy, and in Germany, this program is actually being phased out, and it's primarily a military conscription program as well.
All right, let's see. Again, in your second point, you talked about how the costs from national service outweigh any benefits.
No, we're talking the economic costs outweigh the economic benefits.
Okay. Did you give any examples from any countries that have a national service program or from here in the United States? Or is that basically just an idea that Bruce Chapman had?
As you pointed out, this hasn't been done in any nation before. So what this guy's doing is he's looking at the figures that have been provided by a GEO report and saying that if the system was mandatory, it would have this cost to the economy of $120 billion.
Okay, in your third point, you talked about how there would be a lifelong stigma created if you force young adults into a national service program. Can you just expand a little bit on what this stigma would be and why it would happen?
Okay, essentially because there's going to be young adults who don't want to be there, who are being forced to do something against their will. Mm-hmm. Because of this, they're going to feel like the government is alienating them. They're going to become disillusioned with their society. And when young adults become disillusioned with their society, they're less likely to take active participation in nonviolent means.
Okay, that's all the questions I have.
It's often been said that only in America do we use the word politics to describe the situation so accurately. Poly, in Latin meaning many, and ticks, meaning blood-sucking creatures. Oftentimes, American politics and world politics really does descend into a realm of many blood-sucking creatures. And this is because politicians have mastered the art of rhetoric. However, when the programs that they desire are actually put into practice, oftentimes they don't work. And so while their rhetoric sounds good, in fact, when you put national service into practice, you find that it doesn't work. And that is the main reason why you should not affirm this resolution, and we should not implement national service programs. Now, I'd like to take this time to refute the arguments that my opponents lay out in their case. First of all, they tell you that national service is viewed favorably throughout the international community. But in fact, I have two arguments against this. First, the international community does not, in fact, view national service favorably for the simple reason that if they did, they already would have implemented these programs. In fact, they don't view it favorably because they admit in their last crossfire that no nation in the world actually has a mandatory national service program of the type that they're trying to advocate. But second, the evidence that they claim says that it is viewed favorably throughout the international community does not in fact say that. It simply says that nations have the right to implement such a program. And on this, we have no uncommon ground. But it doesn't actually prove their point that it is viewed favorably. In fact, nations should have the choice, but for the most part, nations should not implement this program. Now, against their second point, where they tell you it's going to be a soft power foreign policy tool, essentially what they're saying is that it gives the United States leverage in the foreign world. But in fact, this is not true, and I have three arguments against it. First of all, we already have the advantage that they're giving you. We already have programs like the Peace Corps and other volunteer programs that can go worldwide. So by voting pro in this and by voting con, you're not actually changing the status quo. You're getting the benefit no matter which side you vote on. But second, actually the soft power foreign policy tool that they advocate doesn't actually have that much power. In fact, its major foreign policy agenda goals, such as the war in Iraq, for instance, or the war in Afghanistan, or the U.S. stance on nuclear proliferation, effect on how the foreign world views us. So, by implementing national service, you're not actually going to change what most of the foreign world thinks about the United States. And finally, they try to tell you that it's actually going to lessen terrorism, but in fact, national service will aggravate terrorism. The main complaint of groups like Al-Qaeda is that the United States is too interventionist, that it tries too much to force its values and policies on other peoples of the world who don't necessarily want them. So when you send more people around the world to try to make sure that people have the same values as us, in fact, you're giving groups like Al-Qaeda, Hamas, and Hezbollah more rather than less recruits. Finally, their third argument is essentially that national service will meet unmet needs in society. But in fact, I have two arguments against this. My first argument is quite simply that an army of untrained workers is essentially useless. This is the argument that Bruce Chapman, who we cite in our case, makes, where he points out that if they're only required to do a year of service, they're not going to have a great amount of training, which means that they're not going to be able to meet all of these social needs they're talking about. Essentially, they list a bunch of needs that could potentially be met, and we agree that every society has problems, but it's solving those problems that ultimately proves to be difficult. And national service isn't the way that you do that, because untrained volunteers just aren't going to be able to make a dent in a problem that professionals that have been working on those problems for decades couldn't make a dent in. And that is my second argument, that quite simply, these problems are too complex to be solved with volunteers. If professionals can't even solve the problems, what makes you think that untrained youth in every country throughout the world are even going to be able to make a dent in problems such as poverty and literacy? So in the end, you have to vote con in this round.
In the last speech, the con team said the politicians have mastered the art of rhetoric. Well, apparently the con team has also, because when you look at the facts, you're going to see that a vote for the pro team is the right choice in today's debate. Now let's look at some of the arguments they bring you in their first speech. First of all, they tell you that there's a potential harm, that costs would outweigh the benefits, and that this would stop all efforts to help society. But let's look at that first argument. They tell you that there's a potential harm for corruption inside this government. But let's look to some of the current existing programs we have right now inside the government and understand that corruption is going to follow the government anywhere. Look to a recent example in the United States government where Roy Blunt, in fact, inserted a tobacco provision inside a Homeland Security bill. At the time, the Homeland Security bill was one of the most looked upon bills inside the United States and was still open to corruption. So what this point is proving to you is that any program inside the government is open to corruption. But here's why national service is one of those programs that is not necessarily as open to corruption as other programs. National service does not benefit any corporation. There's no way to insert a corporate benefit into something like that. National service is solely to set up charities and to help people. And corporate companies don't have any involvement in that, and they won't receive any benefits from this. So they really have no idea and no reason to put their money inside a national service program. Secondly, they tell you that costs would far outweigh benefits, but this is absolutely not true for two main reasons. First of all, when you use a national service program, you actually get money back. As the counter article that they read from Bruce Chapman, they also had another one from Bruce Litton that countered against that from the Brookings Institute. And he examined a 1995 GAO study talking about national service programs, and it cited that quantifiable monetary benefits of $1.68 to $2.58 for every dollar invested in 3 AmeriCorps programs. So what that telling you is that when over a long term, when you put money into a national service program or a service program, you get money back. But also, secondly, the way you benefit from this and why the benefits are far outweigh the cost that you're going to put into this is because you see non-monetary benefits, such things as stronger communities, as we outline in our third point. We also see lower unemployment rate because everybody has a job, but also you have a lot more likelihood of getting a job after this because you gain valuable job experience. But thirdly and finally, look to the fact that it does lower terrorism, and I'll specifically deal with that a little bit later. Thirdly, they tell you this would stop true efforts to help society, but I ask you to give you one example of another country that has a service program like the one we would be implementing all over the world and tell you when this has actually happened. As we told you, the international community favors this. They are not against this, and this does not have a backlash throughout the community. But second and finally, look to countries that have implemented this and understand that service does not stop. Look to countries like Germany, Nigeria, Botswana, Costa Rica, or any other program that has a mandatory service program set up, not necessarily for all young adults. Look at it just for the fact, like, say, Germany, where it's only males. But understand the fact that when you do this, national service does not stop, and you don't have a lot of animosity towards the country. In fact, you go through this program and you realize you want to help more, you want to do more to help, and that 1 year is not sufficient. And if this is true, then look to other countries that have not taken it away. So thirdly, let's look to some of the arguments they bring you against our case. First of all, we give you a piece of evidence that says national service is viewed favorably throughout the world, and they tell you there's no impact. Well, this has a tremendous impact because the only articles they give you are from the United States. These are only domestic articles. The impact here is that this is an international article telling you what we should do for the rest of the world, and in the resolution it says all nations. So we have to look at this on an international approach and not just focus on what's being done inside the United States. Secondly, they tell you we already have benefits of soft power and we already have benefits of the Peace Corps, and that nothing's going to change. Well, the fact is that more people would be able to go into the Peace Corps. I guarantee that not every single person who is in the Peace Corps is one of our best people. We will have more people that will be forced to go into these programs and have some of our strongest minds to go into countries and help these people out. Thirdly and finally, they tell you there's not enough time to train people and that service is going to go down. But understand service is service, and that no service is not as good as some service at all. When you have some service, even if they're not as well trained as, say, the Peace Corps, there's still going to be that level of service and level of people getting helped. Because it only makes sense, please vote pro.
Okay, you would agree that politicians oftentimes do things that serve their own interest, that benefit themselves, right?
Sure.
So doesn't it stand to reason that politicians, particularly in corrupt nations, would use a national service program to serve their own interest?
Well, in any country, the country's leader is going to do something that serves their own interest. But here's the thing about the third world countries, or the countries you're talking about. The only way you can help those countries is by voting for the pro team. Because when you have these groups like the Peace Corps that are from democratic countries, that allows our influence to go into these smaller countries that would be doing things for serving their own good. The thing is, when you vote for the con team, you don't allow any influence or anything to go into those countries.
Right, but what about the countries, for North Korea, for instance, which are hostile to the United States, which wouldn't probably welcome Peace Corps volunteers?
Well, absolutely. I can understand what you're saying, but the fact is that Peace Corps is entirely request-based service. Countries like North Korea, we don't force the United States Peace Corps volunteers to actually go into these countries. It's by request. The fact is we don't have enough Peace Corps to meet all the requests that are going out in the country. So naturally, we would not send our troops inside in North Korea, or we wouldn't send our Peace Corps volunteers inside North Korea.
And then I have one quick question about the Peace Corps. Now, the Peace Corps is a purely volunteer organization, correct?
Yes.
So is there going to be a big market for people who haven't volunteered already to go to the most dangerous states in the entire world to try to bring terrorism down there?
Well, you never bring us any evidence that says we will be going into the most dangerous states all over the world. And what we've seen is that the Peace Corps is a largely successful program because it's been implemented since the Kennedy administration, and we haven't seen it taken away. In fact, we've seen the reverse. We've seen it just increase in the amount of people going into the Peace Corps skyrocket over the past few years.
Right, but what I'm saying is why, for instance, would people... The only way that you get the benefit of lowering terrorism or a soft power tool is if you send them to the most dangerous countries of the world. So why would they do that? Why are people going to volunteer?
Well, because if you're looking at in the current system, Peace Corps volunteers are in fact volunteers. So they all are volunteering to go in some of the most dangerous countries in the world. And under a national service program, like we've seen all over the world, you basically get a choice. You can do either military, you can do domestic service, or international service. And so there is going to be a significant amount of people that are going to choose that international service and understand that for the good of the country and for the good of world peace, that they should go into these other countries and try to foster better relationships. And what we've seen on an international level is that these other countries that are hostile countries that you're talking about don't really have a problem with the people of the United States or with any other country. They only have a problem with the administrations. They have a problem with the policies. And as we told you specifically in our second piece of evidence is that after the Cold War, when other countries had animosity towards the United States, the best way to solve those problems were to have better relationships. And so unless you can prove that better relationships are not fostered by going into these countries, then there's really no basis for this argument.
Okay, do you have any questions for me?
No, I do not.
I'm sorry?
I don't have any questions for you.
Okay, then one quick last question. Isn't it true that the study you cite claiming economic benefits actually studied 3 voluntary AmeriCorps programs and that the GAO actually said it's not plausible to apply it to universal service?
No, what it's saying in that is that a volunteer... Oh, sorry. What's that saying is that a volunteer program that are even more well-paid than national service programs are able to sustain on an economic level. And so that's all that piece of evidence was saying.
In order to evaluate whether or not a certain policy should be done, we have to look at the implications of implementing that policy. In order to do that, we have to do a simple cost-benefit analysis. So let's begin by looking at the benefits that they claim to in their case. Now, there are two of these. The first one is that of the soft power in the Peace Corps. Now, the first issue with this is that those who would be willing to serve in the Peace Corps are already serving the Peace Corps. Those who are willing to commit the time are already doing it, so this exists on both sides of the flow. But secondly, they don't refute my partner's response that terrorism will be aggravated by this system because we will be forcing people into countries, and the terrorists' main complaint already is that the United States has too much influence worldwide. So by increasing our influence, we will be increasing the threat of terrorism and decreasing the safety of the world overall. The second major benefit that they try to give you is that they will meet social needs with this. But I have one response to this, and that is that we still see that young adults and volunteers will not be able to do this. We have people who take 6 years of education to become teachers to teach little kids to read and still can't do it. People who go to graduate school to become doctors and still can't do it. There's no reason to believe that people who have spent 2 weeks training will be able to get these benefits that they claim. So now let's look at the enormous cost of mandatory service. The first is the corruptible bureaucracy. Now, they didn't refute the fact that this corruption can happen in the system, and we have to look at the impacts, which is presented in our card, and that there will be an increased social gap between the rich and the poor, and that abusive nations like North Korea and Kim Jong-il will abuse this power to threaten the world's safety. The second major issue in this is cost, and the fact of the matter is that this cost comes from mandatory service, where the study they brings up only talks about voluntary. So what we have to see is that this cost will be prohibitive, and therefore poor nations will not be able to implement this system without bankrupting themselves. And the third most important cost is that it will harm the true spirit of volunteerism. Those who come out of the program will have a stigma against service, and because of that, they will value their government less and have less patriotism, and this will lead to them involving themselves and feeling disillusioned. And the major problem with this is that there will be a rebellion against the society, and this makes the world less safe.
Basically, this entire debate comes down to the question of fact versus fiction. The con team would like you to believe that national service won't work around the world, that it's this really bad idea. But the pro team has shown you through facts and evidence that national service is a good idea, is a thing that we should look towards to help bring unity throughout the world, to help decrease global terrorism, and to help here within the United States and in other nations. Realize again through 3 main points why you should vote pro. Realize first of all that corruption, even today, is a widespread problem in many governments around the world. This card that they bring you, that there's going to be corruption through national service, really has no impact. What you have to do is look to where the benefits come. To which team are you going to see the most benefits? And that's with the pro team. Corruption is going to exist no matter what happens. But if you vote for pro, you're going to see that tens of millions of Americans and tens of millions of people in other nations around the world are going to increase their reading levels. You're going to help people who are needy, help people who are homeless. That's what you're going to see when you vote pro. You're going to help those people. The fact that corruption may exist doesn't really have an impact because it exists either way. Secondly, realize that this debate comes down to whether we should or should not implement national service. We don't have to come up here and show you exactly how each country is going to implement national service or show you the logistics of what's actually going to happen. We just have to prove to you that national service in itself is a good idea. And I think Patrick and I have shown you time and time again that national service is something that we should look towards. Thirdly and finally, you need to vote for the team that is advantageous. The con has told you that there are dictatorships